go on to our last presenter, and you might see, folks, at the bottom of your screen, we've got Gilroy there doing signing, because our last speaker is another old hand at this in Rodney Adams, and Rodney's an adjunct lecturer on Auslan and Deaf Studies. He's a researcher in Indigenous Sign Language and a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney. His passion lies in the revitalisation of Aboriginal sign languages for both deaf and hearing Indigenous peoples, and its socio-linguistic impacts on their mental well-being. And today he'll be presenting on the vitality of Indigenous sign languages. So over to you, Rodney.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I would like to begin my presentation by acknowledging the land of the Darkijung people of the Central Coast of New South Wales. That's where I present from today. I want to say thank you for the opportunity. I am really excited to be focusing on Aboriginal and Indigenous Sign Language. Sorry, excuse me, I have a couple different devices that I'm working with at the same time. Pardon me for just a moment as I set up. I would like to say thanks to Kara Cross. She is from Macquarie University. She has presented earlier today, and she's given me this great gem about Aboriginal Sign Languages and how it reflects just how linguistically diverse Australia was as a country, and how numerous the Indigenous sign languages as well as spoken languages were on the continent. This was in the Rockhampton newspaper on Wednesday, the 1st, August, 1934. It's actually titled "Sign Language is Secret to Blacks," but it's of no secret to us because our ancestors and culture knew this for a long time. And that nearly vanished from our narratives and our use in the modern world, sadly. We know in the past in Australia that there were many different Aboriginal languages, Indigenous communities. There's also other communities across the world. For example, in the United States, the Indigenous Sign Languages of the Plains Indians. So I'm going to explain a little bit what's happening with other projects that are going on about Indigenous Sign Languages and the revitalization of those in their respective communities. How they're trying to bring back those languages. And Aboriginal Sign Language is just another one of those, the various Aboriginal Sign Languages. So I'll talk first about the Plain Indian Sign Language. If you research back, this has a lot of relevance to the Plains Indian people. There were 40+ different tribes that spoke different languages across the Plains area that's now the United States. And so what they used to do to communicate with each other was have a signed language to communicate with each other. So each tribe would then communicate using that language. So all 40+ different groups could communicate using the signed language. Now, with the impact of colonialization, many of those tribes in North America they are trying now to revitalize their languages, including the signed languages, as part of their cultural history and as part of their culture. I will speak more about this a bit later. Recently, they have had a camp where they have a Cree language, the spoken language, as well as the Plains Indian language, and they teach both of them and they communicate with them. And the people in the area, the indigenous people of the area, are now revitalizing that language as a reminder for the people in that area that the language, or both of those languages, are part of their history. So many elders, parents and grandparents do remember the usage of the signed languages, and that it was used in everyday language at the time. And they want to show that it's still important to continue to use this language in their tribe. The next one I want to talk about is Hawaiian Sign Language. Back in 2018, they started doing linguistics research. One woman presented at a conference about Hawaiian Sign Language and how that is almost extinct and that they need to revitalize that language. So they are in the process of making videos of that language, and they are slowly trying to grow it again. So that is now a bigger part of the deaf community in Hawaii, trying to establish that again. And as American Sign Language had taken over the Hawaiian Sign Language in Hawaii, and so many people use American Sign Language and drop the old Hawaiian Sign Language. And now they're trying to bring that back. They used to think that it was a lesser language than American Sign Language, so they didn't use it. So that was internalized many of the attitudes that they had towards the Indigenous Sign Language, that the American Sign Language was better. So a lot of people internalized that attitude that the other language was of a higher status than theirs. But now they are teaching it now. There's one woman who knows a Hawaiian Sign Language, and she is holding classes via Zoom during the pandemic and trying to continue this revitalization effort. And the third language I want to speak about today is the Yonu Sign Language. And there was recently published a book about Yonu Sign Language, and it's both popular with hearing and deaf people. And you can buy this book now. At the moment, though, there's language teaching happening through Zoom and also on a digital formats as well. They have the book, and they are now revitalizing and trying to spread the words across Australia. The next PowerPoint slide shows how Indigenous Sign Languages, where they came from around Australia. So why Indigenous Sign Languages? If you can look at the map itself, you can see there's sign language all over Australia. There's a very rich diversity of spoken languages, but also as rich diversity with Indigenous Sign Languages. The research into language of why this is important, they've done a lot of research for spoken language and the impact it has on the community. And they can clearly see that many people say that they want the languages of their history and culture to be revitalized, that that's part of their community, and they want to bring back those languages, and that how positive impact it has on the people of those communities. So there's a lot of evidence about the language and how it can really affect the spiritual and emotional, physical impacts on the people. Now, deaf and hard of hearing people, there's a high percentage of deaf Indigenous people and Torres Strait Islander people who there's a bit of a gap between their Indigenous Sign Language because they don't have access to their spoken language. They either know spoken English or the local sign language. So there's a lot of revitalization that they want to have with Indigenous Sign Language to improve the education and educational goals for these individuals. A perfect example would be when a group of people set up a sign language with, say, for example, at the present day, English, chemistry, for example. You can see at the bottom PowerPoint, there's a chemistry class, and the signs that include the concepts and the knowledge and the understanding of chemistry. It helped deaf students become more aware of the chemistry concepts rather than the spoken English or the written English words. So it was very difficult with the English to be able to understand the concepts of the chemistry. So this study was done in America, and students, they had interpreters and linguists who came up with a bunch of signs for the chemistry courses. And the impact that it had, as you can see on the slide, is that afterwards, 90% afterwards, their marks had improved. So the concept of deaf gain. In my field, linguistics and education, it's a big focus on deaf gain for deaf and hard of hearing people. There's often a deficit model, a medical model for viewing those with deafness, which can be a negative perspective. Deaf people have now come up with their own label. They don't want to be labeled by others as having something that's deficit. They have a loss, a hearing loss. They feel that that's a negative perspective, and they have come up with this other perspective of deaf gain, a positive way of looking at the same scenario. So by looking at it that way, it transforms the narrative from having a hearing loss to having a deaf gain. And then that people can see deaf people as in a positive light, as being equal to others. So the Indigenous communities, they lived that deaf gain experience every day by using Indigenous Sign Languages. It was implemental in their culture and in their languages. Now in North America, in Canada, recently they found, I think, 7,400 children that they had found from different schools, and one school used plain sign language, and it was banned at the time. They were using the Indigenous Sign Language, but that had been banned. And there was a lot of misunderstandings in the communications. They had robbed them of their culture, and they used their plain sign language, the Indigenous Sign Language, and they used that. And the hearing people use that to strip the people of their identities. So that's just an example of how in the past the Indigenous communities had been treated and Indigenous Sign Language had been treated. In the schools, they even used that. They used it to communicate with each other. So deaf or hard of hearing people, Indigenous people, they are both marginalized groups. And deaf people in this group have multiple marginalizations. They have a lack of access. It's difficult to have access and get normal services without either interpreters or captions or other ways of support. And a lot of times the community won't allow them to have access. They don't provide those accesses. So the deaf and hard of hearing suffer because of it. Another example, in Aboriginal, New South Wales Aboriginal students, they're up to 36 months behind in learning because that's the impact of this. They are even further marginalized. And they are finding that they have this both marginalizations. They're both dual discrimination and disadvantaged dually because of being Indigenous as well as being deaf or hard of hearing. So now the research has shown relying only on hearing, like as in amplification devices like cochlear implants and hearing aids, does not show success in deaf or hard of hearing students. That's not enough. There needs to be additional supports as well in educational experiences for deaf Aboriginal people or deaf people in general. So language, there's a lot of language issues with deaf children and deaf adults because of this lack of education. So just relying on the hearing devices is not enough of a support. So the next question is, can sign languages exist in a hearing-centric world? Well, a perfect example is in Victoria, the school provides language. If you look at this schedule in front of you here, Auslan is 6th. So people learn that in schools, can learn Auslan in schools. So it's a perfect example of how people are now allowing that as considered as another language equal to other spoken languages. So before there used to be a focus only on spoken languages. And they were happy to improve, they're saying it improved the cultural sensitivity and other areas of education. And that was a strong part of the schools. And now they're allowing this for Auslan as well. They showed with studies of the brain that it does help the brain develop when you learn another language, both a spoken language as well as a signed language. If you see on here, Auslan is popular, but at the same time, the percentage of deaf people in those courses are very small. So really, deaf people don't have ownership of their own language. They don't have that control of their language because there's not enough deaf people trained. At the same time, there's not enough respect for deaf people to have them work in the schools. So that is an area that needs to be improved upon. So that's the end of my paper, and there's more information and other research I'm going to be doing. There's a lot to think about. We're just scratching the surface with Indigenous Sign Languages. There's a lot more focus that needs to happen, more funding that will focus on Indigenous Sign Languages and the benefits that you have from them. For example, the many Indigenous, deaf and hard of people who are incarcerated at the moment. And we need to include sign language for access for them to help them to rejoin society and improve communication for them. So we see many examples of that with visual languages and how that can be improved. That can improve the social and emotional well-being of those individuals. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Awareness raising for all of us, and to see the challenges that we face across the health, in addition to the justice that you raised in ensuring that we really are able to treat people with equal treatment across the nation. So do we have any questions? So yes. So there's a few in the chat.
Okay, we have a question from Isabel O'Keefe. I'd love to hear your perspective on possible positive roles for multilingualism, multimodalism, spoken and signed languages for helping Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children with fluctuating hearing loss.
Yes, I think at the moment to bring back many different ways that Aboriginal people have learned. We're talking about translanguaging very visual people who use lots of visual aspects of the world. I think that's very important to bring that back. For example, recently in the Kempsey school, there was a school there with 70% Aboriginal students, and they said because of coronavirus, it was difficult because many people were wearing a mask. It was really difficult for them to focus and communicate with others. So they had to find different options of a way of communicating to overcome that lack of access because of the masks. So trying to rely solely on being able to hear was difficult. So it is shown through dance, for example, Indigenous cultures show it through dance, through sign language. There are other visual ways to show communication, and using those other ways rather than just the one way. The philosophies and the many different ways to communicate. I sometimes think that we need to go back to the ways it used to be done, find out how they used to teach, and find other ways that the deaf and hard of hearing children can learn culturally.
Yeah, thank you, Rodney. And we've had some comments in the chat line also expressing their appreciation. But
we just had another question.
we just had a question from Catherine Bashorky.
Are you researching signing in Australian Indigenous languages?
That's what his PhD.
Yes. That's my PhD topic, will focus on Australian Indigenous languages. In Australia, we need a lot more work to catch up, because we look at, say, for examples that we have in America, they're way ahead of us as far as their research in their Indigenous sign languages. What they provide over there, sometimes I wish I could bring that over here to Australia. So yes, that is going to be my focus, though, is Indigenous Australian sign languages.
And Rodney, it's Tom. In your research so far, you showed that map of Australia with all the different languages being taught, but that was back in '88 when that was written. Is there a more up-to-date analysis of where signing is happening?
No, Adam Keening, he published that book in 1988, like you said. And that was, he had gathered all the information. I can't remember where exactly he got that information from, but that was in the, as far as in history books, you find that, or in other sort of sources, you can find that research. And it was compiled together to show where the languages were. So going back to the 1820s and 1900s, they have a lot of different maps that show the history, and you can go back and look at sort of how it has gone through the history and changed over time. But just a visual to show the history of the languages.
Yeah, because what's interesting is that we've just had the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and we're going into the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and whether they've actually considered signing as part of that whole movement. Yes, 2019, they had that Day of Indigenous Sign Languages and Indigenous Languages, and many papers were published in that time. And a lot of people were, I remember a lot of people were coming up to me at that time to talk about my topic, and they were really excited about it. You know, anything related to gestures or signs or things like that. And it is part of the culture that we do need to research and revitalize and bring back. And because it's not enough to only rely on what is done in the hearing aspect of things, but we also need to add this signed language aspect of things. So I'm really looking forward to this next decade and working on the research and compiling all this information about Indigenous Sign Languages in Australia. Yeah, no, that's excellent. Thank you, Rodney. We have